Hey guys, tonight before we go anywhere at all, I need you to do one thing for me. I need you to picture a young woman on her wedding morning. Not a storybook wedding, not the grand affair with white silk and orange blossoms that the wealthy women of the East were having in their parlors and churches, while the rest of America went about its ordinary life. I mean a February morning in Wisconsin in 1860, when the temperature had dropped overnight and the frozen ground made the kind of silence that only deep winter makes. The kind of silence that gets into your bones and stays there. A farmhouse near the village of Concord, a young woman with dark hair, 20 years old, who had been awake since before dawn. Her name was Caroline Lake Quiner, and she was getting dressed. The dress she put on that morning was something remarkable. Dark green wool, finely woven, with a pattern all over it that looked, if you tilted your head just right in the morning light, like tiny ripe strawberries. The buttons that ran up the front of the bodice were dark red, the colour of cherry blossoms in July. And inside, hidden from everyone who would ever look at her, the seams were boned with whalebone and stitched with hundreds of tiny crisscross stitches, each one placed by the hands of a professional dressmaker. Not a neighbour woman, not Caroline's own careful needle. A dressmaker. From the East. That detail matters more than it might seem right now. A dressmaker from the East meant money. It meant connection. It meant a world of commerce and refinement that existed on the other side of Lake Michigan, in the cities and towns that Caroline's father had travelled to on his trading voyages, before he died, before everything changed. We are going to come back to what happened to Caroline's father, because understanding what she lost before she was 5 years old is the only way to understand what she was hoping for on her wedding morning. It is the only way to understand what that green dress truly was, and what its eventual fate says about the life she was walking into. With her careful steps and her careful hands, and her heart full of something that was equal parts hope and practicality, which was the only combination that made sense for a woman in her position in 1860. The man she was marrying was named Charles Philip Ingalls. He was 24 years old. He was a carpenter's son, lean and dark-eyed. With a fiddle he played beautifully and a disposition that most people who knew him described as cheerful and generous and restless. He liked to be moving. He liked to look west and imagine what was out there. He was the kind of man who could talk himself and you into believing that the next place would be better, the next season would turn things around, the next piece of land was the one that would finally yield the life he had promised. He was not a man without qualities. He was genuinely talented. He genuinely loved his family. He was capable of enormous physical effort, extraordinary kindness, and the kind of stubborn optimism that either saves a life or ruins one depending on which way the wind is blowing when you need it most. But on the morning of the 1st of February 1860, all of that was still ahead of them. All Caroline knew was the dress, the cold, the quiet, and the particular feeling of a life suspended between what it has been and what it is about to become. She married him that morning in the farmhouse near Concord. The ceremony was brief and practical and warm in the way that ceremonies among people who do not have money for excess can be warm, which is to say, it was genuine. She was surrounded by family. The house smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. Charles likely played his fiddle later, because Charles almost always played his fiddle later. And then Caroline folded the dress. Or rather, she wrapped it, carefully, in paper, laid it away in the bottom of whatever storage they had in that first Wisconsin home, not because it was finished, not because she was done with it, but because it was too good for every day, and every day was coming now. In a long and unbroken series, the dress was for something special. The dress was for the occasions that a life like hers was always promising, the parties and the dances and the moments of celebration that were just ahead, just around the next corner, just waiting for the circumstances to be right. She was 20 years old. She did not know that 42 years would pass before she was widowed. She did not know that in all of those 42 years across 6 states and territories, through 7 pregnancies, past 2 grasshopper plagues, and the death of a son, and a midnight flight from creditors, and a winter so severe that the family ground grain in a coffee mill to survive, she would never once own another dress like that one. Not another good dress. Not a fashionable dress. Not a dress made by a dressmaker from any direction, east or west or anywhere at all. One dress. for her entire life. And her daughter Laura, who grew up watching that green dress wrapped in paper at the bottom of the trunk, who became one of the most widely read authors in American history, who described her mother's cooking and her mother's mending and her mother's quiet courage in 9 books that sold 60 million copies and shaped the way an entire nation chose to remember its pioneer past Laura, mentioned that dress exactly once. Once. In the first book. In a single chapter. In a handful of sentences that described it as beautiful and charming, and a reminder of a time when Ma had been very fashionable. And then Laura put the dress away again. In all the volumes that followed across every crop failure and every desperate winter and every new territory they moved to when the last one failed them, the dress does not appear. Laura does not say, "This is all she has." Laura does not say, "This is what it looks like when a woman's life is slowly stripped of everything it once promised." Laura does not say, "That paper around the green wool is a kind of tomb." She said nothing. Tonight, after all these years, we are going to say it. But before we can understand what was left out, we have to understand what was there. We have to go back to the beginning, further back, even than that February morning in Wisconsin. We have to go back to a Lake Michigan in the morning in 1845, when Caroline Queener was 5 years old and her father had not yet come home from a trading voyage. And the water kept no records of what it took. Henry Quiner was a trader, which in the Wisconsin of the 1840s meant a man who moved things between people who had them and people who needed them. He dealt with local Native American communities over land routes and on the water. He understood the commerce of the Great Lakes world: timber, grain, goods, the endless movement of materials between the interior and the coasts. The family lived near Brookfield, close enough to Milwaukee to know what city life looked like, far enough west to be firmly in the frontier. It was a world of modest possibility, not wealth, but not nothing either. In 1845, Henry Quiner's ship went down on Lake Michigan. The details are spare, as details of ordinary disasters often are when they happen to people. The historical record does not care very much about. There was a storm. There was a voyage. And then there was the silence that follows when a man who left on a Tuesday simply does not come back on Wednesday, or Thursday, or ever. Caroline was 5 years old. Charlotte Quiner, her mother, was left alone with 5 children under 10 and pregnant with a 6th. No husband, no income, no safety net beyond what neighbours and community and Henry's former trading partners were willing to provide. And in the Wisconsin of 1844, what neighbours and community provided was exactly enough to survive on, if you were very careful and very grateful and never once lost the composure that survival required. There is something Caroline absorbed from her mother in those years that is worth naming directly. She learned that a person who leaves can leave for good. She learned that the world makes no accommodations for grief. She learned that the children still need to be fed on the morning after the worst news imaginable, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, stretching out into a future that has no shape yet, but needs to be lived through regardless. She learned that you make do. You gather what you can, you thank the people who help you, and you keep moving, not because moving makes you feel better, but because stopping means something you cannot afford to let happen. This is the woman who married Charles Ingalls on the 1st of February in 1860. Not a girl, not a romantic, a woman who had already learned, at the age of 5, that the world does not owe you what it takes. And yet there was the dress. There was the dressmaker from the East, the fine dark wool, the red buttons, the whalebone seams. There was the fashionable young woman that Caroline had been before marriage, before the frontier, before the long sequence of events that was about to unfold. The dress was not just clothing. The dress was evidence. Evidence that she had been seen, that she had been valued enough for someone to spend real money clothing her, that she was the kind of woman whose hands deserved fine things against them. She wrapped it in paper. She laid it in the trunk. And she went west with Charles Ingalls into the big woods of Wisconsin, where their first home was a small log cabin on the edge of the forest. And Mary was born in 1865, and Laura was born in 1867, and the years passed in the rhythm of seasons and work, and a life that was modest but not yet truly desperate. Charles built furniture and played his fiddle. Caroline cooked and sewed, and kept the house so clean that the children would remember it for the rest of their lives. There were neighbours, there was family nearby, there were the particular small pleasures of a community, the church meetings, the visiting, the occasional dance at someone's home. It was at one of those dances, a sugaring off party at Grandpa Ingalls' house, sometime in the late 1860s, that the dress came out of the paper for what Laura's books describe as the only time the girls ever saw their mother wear it. Ma heard about the party, and she smiled and she said quietly, with a happiness that Laura would remember her whole life, "I'll wear my delaine." Those 4 words, "I'll wear my delaine." Laura wrote about what happened next. Ma putting on the dress, how beautiful it was, how it transformed her mother from the woman who cooked and mended into someone who had once been fashionable and still could be. For one evening, for one dance, in a warm house full of neighbours while the maple sugar cooled and Pa played the fiddle. Laura described the dress in exact, loving detail. The dark green, the strawberry pattern, the red buttons, the whalebone seams with their hundreds of tiny crises cross-stitches. She wrote it beautifully, and then she put the dress away again. In the next 8 books covering the family's move to Kansas, the return to Wisconsin, the years at Plum Creek in Minnesota, the catastrophic summers of the grasshopper plagues, the death of a baby, the midnight flight from Iowa, the hard winter in Dakota Territory, the building of De Smet, Laura's courtship and marriage across all of that, across all of those years and all of that suffering and all of those relocations and all of those seasons, when there was simply nothing left, the green delaine dress does not appear. Not once. And the question that nobody ever asked, the question that Caroline, who left no letters and no diary and no direct testimony of any kind, was never given the opportunity to answer is this. Why did she never get another one? That question seems simple. It is not. The answer to that question is the story of a woman's entire life. The answer is the story of a federal land policy that promised prosperity and delivered ruin. The answer is the story of a man who loved his family and kept moving them toward a horizon that kept retreating. The answer is the story of a daughter who loved her mother and wrote 9 books about their life together, and somehow, in all of that writing, managed to leave out the one detail that would have changed everything. A reader understood about what pioneer life actually cost the women who lived it. The green dress is not a charming detail. It is a document. And tonight, we are going to read it. But first, I need to take you somewhere. I need to take you to a wheat field in Minnesota, in the summer of 1875, because what happened there, what descended on that field on an ordinary July morning, is the moment this story turns. It is the moment the dress became permanent, the moment the paper around it became final, the moment Caroline Ingalls stopped hoping for another good dress and began simply surviving on the one she had. And it came from the sky. Trillions of them. More than you can imagine. More, honestly, than historians have ever fully been able to communicate with people sitting comfortably in the present, because the numbers involved are the kind of numbers that the human brain was not designed to process. We will get there in Chapter 3. But before we get to Minnesota, I need to take you to Kansas. Because Kansas is where the pattern began. Kansas is where the promise of free land first showed its teeth. And Kansas is where a young wife with a trunk full of paper and a green wool dress first began to understand what the rest of her life was going to ask of her. That is Chapter 1, and I promise you we are only just beginning to understand what this story is really about. Are you ready to continue? Chapter 2 is waiting, and we are heading to Kansas to illegal ground, to a log cabin built on land that was never legally theirs, and to the moment Caroline Ingalls began to understand that her husband's wandering foot was not romance. It was something else entirely. Say the word and we'll go. There is a phrase in the Little House books that gets repeated enough times that it becomes, over the course of 9 volumes, almost a kind of family motto. Pa's wandering foot gets to itching. Laura used it with affection. She used it the way you describe a beloved relative's most characteristic quality, the one that is slightly exasperating and deeply lovable all at once. Charles Ingalls, in the books Laura wrote about him, was a man moved by something poetic and irresistible, something frontier, something American. When the trees crowded too close and the neighbours moved too near and the land stopped feeling like possibility, Pa heard the call of somewhere else, and the family packed up and followed him. And that was simply who they were: movers, pioneers, people for whom the horizon was a permanent invitation. It is a beautiful story. The historical record tells a slightly different one. The historical record shows a man who moved 6 times in 30 years, not because the trees crowded close, but because the debts piled high. Who relocated his family not toward opportunity, but away from failure, away from missed payments, exhausted soil, evaded creditors. Who described himself, in a legal document, as wholly without means. Who sold his Dakota homestead. After more than 8 years of labor and more than 30 years of property ownership across 5 states, for a net profit of less than $400. That is not wanderlust. That is a man running as fast as his wagon could carry him from the accumulated evidence of a dream that never worked. And every time he ran, Caroline packed the trunk. Every time he ran, the dress went back into the paper. Every time he ran, the children climbed into the wagon in the dark, or the early morning, or the cold middle of a season when the crops had failed again. And they did not ask questions because there were no good answers, and because Caroline, who understood this better than anyone, had taught them not to ask. Let me tell you about Kansas. In the fall of 1869, Charles Ingalls loaded his family into a covered wagon and drove south from Wisconsin, toward the territory that the railroads and the speculators and the government pamphlets were calling the great open opportunity of the American frontier, the Osage Diminished Reserve, southeastern Kansas. Land that was being made available, or was about to be made available, or was expected soon to be made available, depending on which version of the story you prefer to believe for homestead claims by white settlers. There was one problem with this plan. The Osage Nation had not yet agreed to anything. The land was not open. The treaties were not finalized. The negotiations were still happening. In Washington, in the strained language of a federal government trying to remove a people from their home territory while maintaining enough legal cover to call it something other than what it was. And in the meantime, in the gap between what the government intended and what it had not yet managed to make official, families like the Ingalls were streaming into the reserve by the hundreds. The 1,870 United States Census recorded the Ingalls household as the 89th residents of Rutland Township, Montgomery County, Kansas. 89 families, all of them technically illegal, all of them building cabins and ploughing soil and planting gardens on ground that belonged, by every existing legal and moral measure, to someone else. And Charles Ingalls was among them, not a villain, not a man of malicious intent, but a man who had made the calculation that thousands of others were making at the same time, that the law would catch up with the reality eventually, and that the reality he was counting on was the one that ended with his name on a deed. Caroline packed the trunk and she followed him. She was 30 years old, Mary was 4, Laura was 2, and in August of 1870, in the log cabin Charles built on the Kansas Prairie, baby Carrie arrived, the first Ingalls child born outside of Wisconsin, a detail that would make her, in a small but permanent way, a child of the frontier in a way her sisters were not. Laura was 3 years old during the Kansas years. What she remembered was what a 3-year-old remembers: the quality of light on the prairie grass, the sound of Pa's fiddle, the way the Osage people moved through the landscape of her early childhood in ways that she absorbed without vocabulary or context, the way small children absorb everything, completely and incompletely at the same time. What she did not remember, because she was too young to understand it, was the machinery of occupation grinding beneath the surface of those golden-lit mornings. The fact that every meal they ate and every log Charles split and every garden Caroline planted was on ground that was not theirs to farm. The fact that the Osage Nation was being pressured, year by year and treaty by treaty, into surrendering the last of what had once been a vast territory. The fact that the families pouring into the reserve were not brave pioneers claiming free land. They were, in the precise language of the period, squatters. Laura would later explain the family's departure from Kansas by writing that soldiers came to order the white settlers off the Indian land. This makes for a clean, comprehensible story. The government told them to leave, so they left. It is the kind of explanation a child might give for something a child could not have fully understood. filtered through 60 years of memory and the particular literary sensibility of a woman who had been trained by experience and by her daughter's editorial hand to make the family's failures look like something other than failures. The historical reality was quieter and considerably more embarrassing. The land came up for legal sale. A preemption claim required cash. Charles Ingalls did not have cash. The man from Wisconsin who was supposed to have bought the family's Wisconsin property could not make his payments. Without that money, there was no way to purchase the Kansas claim. And without a legal claim, there was no future in Kansas. So Charles packed the wagon and headed back north, and the family that had spent 2 years building a life on ground that was never theirs simply left. Baby Carrie was not yet a year old. Laura was 3. If Caroline had thoughts about this, if she felt the particular hollowness of packing the trunk again, of loading the good dishes and the quilt and the paper-wrapped dress, and climbing back into the wagon and pointing it north, she left no record of those thoughts. She left no record of anything. There is no letter, no diary, no scrap of paper in Caroline Ingalls' handwriting anywhere in the historical archive. The woman who endured 42 years of marriage on the frontier left no more trace of her inner life than the ground she crossed. We have only what Laura wrote. And Laura, who watched her mother pack that trunk with her characteristic careful efficiency on the morning they left Kansas, did not write about what it cost. She wrote about sunflowers. She wrote about the grass. The family returned to Wisconsin for a few years. This period, the years between Kansas and Minnesota, when the Ingalls were back near relatives in the big woods, appears almost nowhere in the little house books. The omission is not accidental. The Wisconsin return is quiet, ordinary, unheroic. There are no great adventures to be told. There is just a family, back where they started living near people who know them. Mary walking to school, Laura learning to read, Caroline cooking in a kitchen that was not the edge of the world. It is, in other words, the most stable the family would be for the next 20 years. And Charles left it. In 1874, he moved them again, to Walnut Grove in Redwood County, Minnesota, where the railroad was coming through and the land was fertile and the wheat fields of the river valley stretched out under a sky that looked big enough to hold any amount of hope. He took a homestead claim and a tree claim 160 acres, plus an additional 160 if he planted enough trees. He initially settled into the family in a dugout house on the bank of Plum Creek, a home built into the hillside, roofed with sod, lit by a single small window, with creek water for washing and the sound of grass moving overhead instead of wind in the rafters. Caroline moved into the dugout with her children and her trunk and her dress. She did not complain, at least, not on any record that has survived. Whatever she felt about living in a hole in the ground, after having lived in actual houses in Wisconsin and Kansas and back in Wisconsin again, whatever particular quiet she maintained at the supper table, when the children were tired and the dugout was close, and Charles was planning the next season's crop with the enthusiasm of a man who had never yet had a season that went, as planned that quiet was hers. It went into her. But here is what matters about Minnesota. The wheat was good. In 1875, Charles Ingalls planted a crop that was by every account that survives, including Laura's own description, beautiful. Tall and golden and thick in the field, bending in the prairie wind in the particular way that ripening wheat bends when a man has done everything right and the weather has cooperated and the soil has delivered on what it promised. It was the best crop of Charles Ingalls' life. It was going to pay the debts. It was going to let them build a real house above ground. It was going to mean maybe, finally, after Wisconsin and Kansas and back to Wisconsin again, that the wandering was over. That Caroline could take the dress out of the paper and wear it somewhere that meant something. That the children would have warm clothes for school. That the family had arrived. And then something happened. Something that requires a number to understand, and the number is so large that I want you to stay with it for a moment, because numbers like this one tend to slide off the mind if you let them. In the summer of 1875, the sky over Minnesota turned. It did not cloud over. It did not darken the way a storm darkens. It shimmered. It caught the light differently, in a way that some witnesses described as a great white cloud, and others described it as a snowstorm in July. and others simply could not describe at all because there was no prior experience in their lives that had prepared them for what they were seeing. What they were seeing was the Rocky Mountain locust, an estimated 12.5 trillion insects. That is the number that historians and entomologists have calculated for the Albert swarm of 1,875, named after the physician Albert Child, who measured and recorded the swarm as it moved across the Great Plains. 12.5 trillion, a cloud of insects 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide at its broadest point. An area larger than the state of California, moving across the sky, the largest recorded gathering of any animal species in the history of the world, according to Guinness World Records. 12.5 trillion. They came for Charles Ingalls' wheat first, or rather, they came for everything, for every crop in a swath of states that included Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Missouri. And Charles Ingalls' wheat was simply one of the millions of fields that ceased to exist that summer. Within days, there was nothing. The locusts ate the grain, they ate the leaves off the trees, they ate the leather harnesses and the wooden tool handles. They dropped into the creek and turned it foul. They coated the roads so thickly that horses could not get traction on them, and when they left behind something even worse: eggs. Millions upon millions of eggs in the ground, waiting to hatch the following spring into a second generation of destruction. The family survived the first year on what they had put by and what neighbours shared and what the county provided. And here is a fact that will matter more as this story goes on. The county provided. The state of Minnesota organised relief efforts for the families destroyed by the plague. Flour and bacon were distributed. State funds were appropriated. Committees were formed. Needs were assessed. Barrels of food were delivered to families who had nothing else. Charles Ingalls signed a document declaring himself wholly without means to receive relief provisions. There is something in that phrase, wholly without means, those cuts through everything the little house books built around his image. Wholly without means, not temporarily short, not in between seasons, wholly without means. A man with a wife and 4 children and a green dress in a trunk, who had nothing left, and said so in writing, in the official language of a system he had been insisting, in one way and another, for years, that he did not need. The family took the flour. Laura did not write about the flour. The second year of the plague came. Charles tried again. The eggs hatched. The locusts came back. Another crop is gone. Another season of nothing. And this time, the cumulative weight of 2 years of total failure settled on the family in ways that even Laura's careful pen could not entirely conceal. Charles left. He walked east, 100 miles east, to find work in other men's wheat fields, because his own fields were gone, because there was no other way to keep the family alive. He left Caroline in the dugout with the children. He left her with very little money and very little food, and the specific, grinding loneliness of a woman managing a household in conditions of genuine deprivation, alone, while her husband walked away from the wreckage of what was supposed to have been their life. He left her with the trunk. He left her with the dress. And in late August of 1876, while Charles was somewhere east of them working in another man's fields, a baby named Charles Frederick Ingalls Freddie, who had been born the previous November, died. He was approximately 10 months old. The exact cause of his death is not recorded. The historical record, which is thorough about Charles's land claims and sparse about Caroline's grief, does not tell us what killed Freddie. What we know is that he was born during a period of extreme stress and deprivation. We know that the family was living on government relief. We know that Caroline was managing alone with 4 children in a dugout on a creek bank with no income and no certainty about when Charles was coming back. We know that the medical care available to a poor family in Redwood County, Minnesota, in 1876 was limited and often inaccessible. We know that infant mortality under those conditions was high. We know that Freddie died. And we know that Laura, who wrote 9 books about her family, and described every Christmas orange and every fiddle tune and every meal her mother cooked with love and care across decades of poverty, never once mentioned her brother. Not once. Not in the published books, though he appeared briefly in the original Pioneer Girl manuscript that became the source material for those books. Freddie Ingalls, the 5th child, the only son, the baby who was born at the worst moment, and died before his first birthday was erased from the family's story entirely, as if he had never existed, as if Caroline had never held him and laid him down somewhere in the Minnesota ground and gone back to the dugout to cook supper for the children who remained. That erasure, that silence, is the first and most devastating thing Laura left out, and it is not the last. Chapter 2 ends here, and I want to sit with you for a moment in what we've just learned, because this is the part where the story becomes something different than what most of us thought it was. Are you ready to go to Chapter 3? Because Chapter 3 is going to take us somewhere where Laura spent the rest of her life trying to forget the midnight that changed everything. Say the word. There is a peculiar silence in the little house books around the years 1876 and 1877. If you have read the series, and most of you have, or you would not be here, you know the basic shape of it. The big woods, then Kansas, then Plum Creek, then Silver Lake, then the hard winter, then De Smet, then Laura's courtship and marriage. The books flow in a more or less continuous line, one volume picking up where the last one ends, following the family through the seasons and the relocations with the particular continuity of a story that knows exactly where it is going. But if you look closely, if you read on the banks of Plum Creek and then open by the shores of Silver Lake, there is a gap. A strange, slightly awkward gap in the narrative where several years of the family's life simply do not appear. The grasshopper plague ends. The family survives. And then, in the next book, the story resumes in Dakota territory, with the girls noticeably older and Mary inexplicably blind, and a vague explanation that covers the intervening years in a handful of pages without dwelling on any of it. The years 1876 and 1877, when the Ingalls family was in Burr Oak, Iowa, do not appear in the Little House books at all. Not one page, not one chapter, not even a reference. This was not an accident. It was not an oversight. Laura, who remembered everything, who described the texture of her mother's dress and the sound of her father's fiddle, and the exact quality of light on a December morning 60 years after the fact, did not forget Burr Oak. She remembered it precisely. She described it in her original memoir, the handwritten manuscript called Pioneer Girl that she completed around 1930, and that was finally published, with annotations, in 2014. The Burr Oak period is in Pioneer Girl. The facts are there. Laura knew them. She chose to leave them out. She chose to leave them out because Burr Oak, Iowa, in 1876 and 1877, was the truth that the Little House books were built to conceal. It was the year that the pioneer dream, stripped of its romantic trappings, showed what it actually looked like from the inside. What it looked like was this. After the grasshopper plague destroyed the Minnesota farm, and Charles walked 100 miles east and Freddie died in the spring, the family had nothing left in Minnesota. They had no crops, no income, no land of their own, and no reason to stay. Charles heard of an opportunity in Burr Oak, a small town in northeastern Iowa, near the bluffs of the upper Iowa River. A hotel partnership. 2 men, Charles and a partner named Stedman, running a grocery and hotel operation in a going concern. It sounded, as these things always sounded to Charles, like the next good chance. They moved in the summer of 1876. Mary was 11. Laura was 9. Carrie was 6. Baby Grace had not yet been born. The family first lived in the master's hotel, then moved to rooms above a grocery store. Both were near a saloon. Laura noted this in Pioneer Girl with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who had learned to register the details of her environment without commenting on them. Near a saloon meant noise at night, meant the sounds of men who had been drinking carrying in through the walls of a room where children were trying to sleep, meant a particular education in what the world looked like when things were going badly for people who had fewer reserves than the Ingalls. It meant a neighborhood. It meant a location. And the location mattered because location, in a small frontier town, told you everything about a family's economic standing. The hotel partnership failed almost immediately. The reasons are unclear, the way the reasons for Charles Ingalls' business failures are almost always unclear, partly because he was not a businessman, partly because the general economic depression of the mid-1870s made all business precarious, partly because the specific arrangement he entered into in Burr Oak was probably unwise from the beginning. What is clear is that by late 1876, Charles was working at a grist mill and taking whatever additional work he could find, and he was away from the family a great part of the time, which is the phrase Laura uses in Pioneer Girl, and which does not quite convey the reality of what that meant for Caroline. What it meant was that Caroline was alone. In Burr Oak, Iowa, in the winter of 1876, with 3 children and a 4th on the way, Grace Pearl Ingalls was born on May 23, 1,877 inches, a house they rented from a man named Benjamin Bisbee, who was, as Laura noted with the quiet precision of someone who understood class, even if she didn't yet have the vocabulary for it, one of the richest men in Burr Oak. The Ingalls were renting from the richest man in town, and they could not pay. This is the part of the pioneer story that gets quietly omitted from the version most Americans know. Not the hardship gets kept, polished into something beautiful and brave, but the humiliation. The specific, intimate humiliation of debt, of owing money to people who have it, and knowing that they know you don't. Of the doctor's bills you cannot pay, and the grocery bills you cannot pay, and the rent you cannot pay, and the horses. The horses are the crucial detail here that your landlord can legally seize if you do not pay what you owe him, and that you absolutely cannot allow to be seized because the horses are your only means of moving, and moving is the only option left. Something happened in the summer of 1877 that Laura described in Pioneer Girl with a restraint that is almost more devastating than direct description would have been. She wrote it like this: "Sometime in the night, we children were waked to find the wagon with a cover on standing by the door. Pa was putting the bed in it. Ma was helping him. When the bed was in, he lifted us up one by one and we lay down on it. The night was warm and still and dark. We could hear Pa and Ma walking around the house, but we could not see them, and we went to sleep again." Read that again. The night was warm and still and dark. They could hear their parents moving, but they could not see their faces, and they went to sleep again. This is what it looks like, the actual texture of it, the sensory reality of it when a family flees in the middle of the night. Not the dramatic, swashbuckling departure of the covered wagon pointed west toward adventure. The quiet, shameful exit of people who cannot pay what they owe and are getting out before anyone can stop them. Children lifted one by one into a wagon, the sounds of their parents moving in the dark, the practiced, terrible efficiency of a family that has learned to pack quickly and leave without explanation. They left unpaid debts behind them. Doctor's bills, grocery bills, the rent owed to Benjamin Bisbee, richest man in Burr Oak. Charles sold the cow to fund the escape. The family's last productive animal, the source of their milk and butter, liquidated in the night to finance a flight that most decent people would prefer not to have to take. And in the wagon, in the trunk, in the paper, absolutely untouched the dress. There is one more detail from the Burr Oak period that I need to tell you about, because it is the kind of detail that stays with you. The kind of detail that, once you know it, changes the way you read every subsequent description of Caroline Ingalls' cheerfulness and composure and steady faith. A doctor and his wife in Burr Oak, a Dr. Starr and his wife, offered to adopt Laura. They wanted to take her into their home, raise her as their own. The Starr family was comfortable. They could give her things the Ingalls could not: education, stability, a future that did not depend on whether the next crop survived or the next landlord could be reasoned with or the next state had better soil than the last one. The offer was not unusual by the standards of the era. In the 1870s, placing out poor children with wealthier families was common, even considered charitable. It was understood, in a way that was simultaneously kindly meant and absolutely brutal, that poverty was a kind of unfitness, that a family that could not feed a child was perhaps a family that should not keep that child. Caroline refused. She refused without hesitation, without wavering, without any of the deliberation that a woman in her position might have been forgiven for giving to an offer that would have reduced the number of mouths she was feeding and improved one of her children's prospects enormously. She would not give up any one of her children. Laura remembered this and wrote it in Pioneer Girl, the flatness of the refusal, the completeness of it. No, not this one, not any of them. Whatever was coming next, they were going through it together. Hold that image for a moment. Caroline Ingalls in the winter of 1876, in a rented house near a saloon in Burr Oak, Iowa, unable to pay her bills, nursing a newborn without her husband most of the time, with the green dress in the trunk and the debt growing, and the horses that might be seized at any moment saying no to the woman who wanted to take her 10-year-old daughter. Not out of pride. Exactly. Not out of stubbornness. Out of something that does not have a precise name but that is recognizable to anyone who has loved a child. She would not give up any one of her children. This woman who Laura would later describe as cheerful and capable and endlessly steady. This woman whom the books portray as someone who set the table beautifully even in dugouts, and kept the children's clothes clean even on the prairie, and never once, not in 9 volumes, not in a single passage, expressed anything that looked like the weight of what her life actually was. The Little House books contain a version of Caroline Ingalls, but the woman who stood in that Burr Oak house and said no to the stars, that woman is somewhere else. She is in the Pioneer Girl manuscript. She is in the silence of the historical record. She is in the space around the green dress, in the years it spent wrapped in paper when it should have been worn. The family fled Burr Oak in the summer of 1877. They went back to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, where friends shared their home while Charles found work in a store, and Laura, aged 10, began her working life. She became a hired girl. For 50 cents a week, she moved into another family's house and performed domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare for a woman whose name history has preserved only in passing. 50 cents. A week. For a 10-year-old child separated from her mother and her sisters and sent to work in a stranger's kitchen because the family needed income and a 10-year-old's labor was the income they had access to. Laura would later describe aspects of this period in her writing, though she softened the edges considerably. What she could not entirely soften was the loneliness. The particular loneliness of a child who has learned to work and has not yet learned that working is not the same as being seen. Caroline's dress stayed in the trunk. There was no occasion for it. There was no dance, no party, no gathering at which a woman in Caroline Ingalls' position in the fall of 1877 was going to wear her one good dress. There was survival. There was the next thing. There was the particular daily arithmetic of managing a family at the edge of what was manageable, and doing it without complaint, and doing it in such a way that the children understood it was simply what was required, and not something to be mourned. And then because there was always an "and then" with Charles Ingalls, there was a new opportunity. Dakota Territory. The railroads were going through. The land was opening. In September 1879, Charles moved his family again, this time to the northeastern edge of what would eventually become South Dakota, to work for the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, and to claim a piece of the land that the Dakota boom was promising to everyone willing to come and get it. Caroline packed the trunk one more time. The dress went in, and the family moved into the surveyor's house, a structure that existed not because of pioneer self-sufficiency, but because of federal infrastructure investment and railroad expansion. A detail that Laura would later scrub from the narrative as completely and efficiently as she scrubbed everything else that complicated the myth she was building. But that is a story for Chapter 4. And Chapter 4 is where the winter comes in the winter that nearly killed them. The winter that De Smet's oldest residents still talked about decades later with a particular quiet that told you everything about how close it had come. The hard winter. We will get there. Here is something that does not get said enough about the Ingalls family's arrival in Dakota Territory in the fall of 1879. It was not brave. Not in the romanticized wagon wheels turning toward the golden horizon way that the phrase brave usually implies when someone says it about pioneers. By September of 1879, Caroline Ingalls was 39 years old. She had been on the frontier for 20 years. She had lived in a dugout in the ground. She had buried a child. She had been woken in the middle of the night and loaded into a wagon in the dark. She had watched her daughters stop going to school because there were no warm clothes, and she had sent her 14-year-old away to work in a stranger's kitchen for 50 cents a week because the family could not feed her otherwise. What happened in September of 1879 was not bravery. It was the absence of alternatives. Charles had found work, real, paying, immediate work with the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, which was laying tracks through what would eventually become Kingsbury County, South Dakota. The railroad needed a bookkeeper and timekeeper at their surveying camp, and Charles, the carpenter, the farmer, the failed hotelier, the man who walked 100 miles east to work in other men's fields, could do sums and keep records. So they went. The whole family, with the trunk, with the paper, with the dress inside it, into a wagon pointed at the edge of the world one more time. What they found at the far end of that journey was, by any honest measure, the best house the family had lived in since their years in the Wisconsin big woods. The surveyor's house. It sat at the edge of what would become the town of De Smet, built to house railroad surveyors who had moved on. It had real rooms, more than one. Real floors. Real windows that let in the thin Dakota light in the mornings. It had a cooking stove. It was, in the language of a family that had lived in a dugout hole in the ground, almost palatial. Laura, 12 years old, described it later with the particular reverence of a child who understands, without being able to articulate it, that she is tasting something rare. Caroline unpacked the trunk. She laid things out in rooms, her rooms, or at least rooms that were theirs for this season. And somewhere in that unpacking, somewhere in the familiar ritual of finding places for the things a family carries across a continent, the paper-wrapped dress found its place again. Against a wall. In a corner. In whatever storage a surveyor's house provided for the possessions of a family that had nothing to store except what it could carry. On the 19th of February 1880, Charles Ingalls walked into the federal land office in Brookings, Dakota Territory, and filed a homestead claim. Section 3. Township 110, New Range 56W, Kingsbury County, 160 acres. He swore under oath that he was the head of family, married, with 4 children, that he intended to settle the land and improve it over the required 5-year period, that the land was his intention and would be his in fact once the law confirmed what the paperwork promised. He had done this before. Different states, different land offices, different paper. He had filed claims in Kansas that came to nothing because he couldn't afford to buy the land. He had held a homestead claim and a tree claim in Minnesota that the Grasshoppers took. He had been filing for free land since before some of his daughters were born, and he had never, in any of those filings, managed to turn federal paper into lasting personal wealth. But he failed again, because the Homestead Act was the only tool available to a man in his position, and when you have one tool, you use it. You use it even when you know, somewhere below the level where optimism lives, that the land is marginal and the weather is unpredictable, and that 160 acres of Dakota Territory soil is not going to produce the crop that will finally, at last, break the pattern. You use it because the alternative is to stop believing. And Charles Ingalls, whatever his faults and failures, had never stopped believing. But before the homestead, before the claim was even filed, before the hard winter that was coming began to build itself in the upper atmosphere of the northern plains, something happened to this family that changed it in ways that no document in any federal land office could fix. Mary went blind. She had been ill in the spring of 1879. A scarlet fever epidemic moved through the region, and Mary Ingalls, 14 years old, golden-haired, studious, the daughter who was going to be a teacher, the one who had already been singled out as unusually bright, contracted a severe illness that historical scholarship now believes involved meningitis, or a stroke caused by viral meningoencephalitis. The medical understanding of the 1870s offered no treatment, no prognosis, no roadmap for what was happening to a teenager in a house on the Dakota Prairie, while her family watched and prayed and waited. The illness passed. The sight did not return. Mary Ingalls, who had been reading since before she could reliably hold a book, who had walked ahead of her sisters on the path to school because she was always the first one ready, who had absorbed the world through her eyes with the same completeness that most of us absorb it without ever noticing we do. Mary was blind. For the rest of her life. She was 14 years old. The Little House books describe this moment with a gentleness that is almost unbearable. Laura writes about holding her sister's hand, about learning to be Mary's eyes, about describing landscapes so that Mary could see them through Laura's words. It is genuinely beautiful. It is also genuinely incomplete, because what the books do not describe, what they never describe, is what Mary's blindness cost. Not emotionally, materially. A blind daughter in a poor family in Dakota Territory in 1879 required care, assistance, and eventually, if she was to have any life beyond the four walls of her parents' home, education. Real education. Specialized education. The kind of education that existed in one specific place. The Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, Iowa. It was not free. The tuition, the board, the clothing that Mary would need modest, practical, appropriate for a school setting. The travel costs between Vinton and De Smet, twice a year at minimum, across hundreds of miles. All of it added up to a number that Charles Ingalls, bookkeeping for a railroad survey camp, did not have. So, the family did what poor families have always done when the need exceeds the income. They figured out what they could sell, and what they had to sell, the only asset available, the only commodity in sufficient supply, was Laura. Not Laura herself. Not in the way they had considered in Burr Oak. What they had to sell was Laura's labour, her mind, her ability to stand in front of a room full of children and teach them to read and write and add. Caroline had been a teacher before her marriage. She had passed that competence to her daughter, along with everything else she passed. The ability to manage, to endure, to make something useful out of whatever was at hand. But that comes in a moment. First, we have to get through the winter. October 1880. It started as winters on the northern plains. Always start with a cold front moving in from Canada, a temperature drop, the first serious snowfall of the season. The settlers of the new town of De Smet, which had sprung up around the railroad in the months since the Ingalls arrived, had seen Dakota winters before. Some of them had. They had stocked provisions. They had filled their cellars. They had done the arithmetic of months versus food and believed they had come out ahead. They had not. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 was not a Dakota winter. It was a siege. 7 months of blizzards, arriving in sequence, each one before the last had fully released its grip on the land. The snow did not melt between storms. It accumulated, pressing down on roofs, blocking roads, drifting against walls until buildings disappeared beneath it up to their eaves. The train stopped running in October and did not run again until April. When the train stopped running, so did the food supply, and the coal, and the kerosene, and everything else is that a new railroad town depends on arriving on schedule from the wider world. De Smet was cut off. The Ingalls family, living in their small house on 3rd Street, the townhouse Charles had built after it became clear the homestead claim on the prairie was too exposed for winter, habitation was cut off along with everyone else. The temperature outside fell to 40 below zero. The temperature inside was only livable because they kept a fire burning, and the fire needed fuel, and fuel was disappearing. Caroline twisted hay. That is the image that stays with me from this period. Every time I think about what this woman endured across 42 years. When the coal ran out, the family burned hay. Not simply threw hay on the fire, they twisted it. Took handfuls of dried prairie hay and twisted them, tight, into a kind of rough stick that would burn longer and hotter than loose hay. This was done with bare hands, repeated thousands of times across hundreds of days. The hay is cut into palms. The constant gripping motion numbed fingers and fatigued arms. And there was no end to it, because the moment you stopped twisting, the fire went out, and the family froze. Caroline twisted hay. Charles twisted hay. The girls twisted hay. And when the food ran out, when the last of the flour was gone, and there was nothing left in the house except the sacks of wheat seed Charles had kept for spring planting, the seed that was supposed to go into the ground, not into people, they ground the wheat in a coffee mill. A coffee mill. Not a grain mill. Not a proper flour mill. A small hand-cranked household coffee grinder, the kind designed for perhaps a pound of beans at a time, repurposed to produce enough course meals to keep 5 people alive. They took turns at it. They ground flour one small batch at a time, every day, all winter. It produced enough for a thin bread that kept them upright. It was all they had. But they were alive. and the town, the 50-odd souls who had committed to spending their first Dakota winter in a settlement that had not existed 18 months earlier, was running out of food entirely. There was a homesteader, a man named Anderson, who had 60 bushels of wheat on his claim 20 miles south of De Smet. 60 bushels, enough to keep the town alive until the trains ran again. But 20 miles across frozen, drifted prairie in blizzard conditions, with no road visible and no guarantee of which direction led to the claim, was 20 miles that might as well have been 200. 2 young men went anyway. Almanzo James Wilder, 23 years old, and his friend Cap Garland rode out into the breaks between blizzards with horses and a grain sled, navigating by instinct and luck across a landscape that had no landmarks, that was white and featureless in every direction. They found the claim. They loaded the wheat. They came back. They brought 60 bushels of wheat back to De Smet. The town survived the winter on that wheat. Laura, 13 years old, knew the young man's name. She had been aware of Almanzo Wilder for some time. He was 10 years older than her, the owner of a beautiful, matched team of horses that he handled with the particular skill of a man raised to know horses the way other men know weather. He was the son of a prosperous New York farmer, which meant he understood farming in a way that Charles, the carpenter's son from Cuba, New York, never quite had. She filed the name away. She would have reason to return to it. The hard winter ended in May of 1881. The trains ran again, the food came in, the town exhaled, and then, quietly, in the way that the most important things in this family's life always happened quietly without fanfare, without the dramatic announcement that a moment of this wait deserved, Mary Ingalls left home. She travelled to Vinton, Iowa, to the Iowa College for the Blind. She was 16 years old. She would live there, with a brief return to De Smet for the next 5 years. She learned Braille. She learned to play the organ. She learned a range of skills designed to give a blind woman the kind of self-sufficiency that the Victorian era considered appropriate for someone in her condition, which is to say, enough independence to function within the domestic sphere, not enough to challenge it. She was, by all accounts, a dedicated and talented student, and for every semester she spent in Vinton, every room and board payment the school required, the money came from one place: Laura. In December 1883, Laura Ingalls, 16 years old, without a high school diploma or any formal teaching credentials beyond a certification examination, she had passed on the strength of her own intelligence, and her mother's early teaching took a position at the Brewster School, 12 miles from De Smet. 12 miles. In Dakota territory. In January, she boarded with the Brewster family, a family she described in later years with the careful diplomacy of someone who is choosing not to say what she actually thinks, which tells you something. And she spent her weeks teaching children who were sometimes older than she was in a single-room schoolhouse, and her weekends going home. When she could go home, she was 16 years old, and she was the family's financial engine. The books Laura would later write about this period describe her teaching as a necessary inconvenience, an interruption in the courting she was beginning to value from Almanzo Wilder, who drove his sleigh out to collect her on Friday afternoons and return her on Sunday evenings with a courtesy that was, in Dakota territory in the 1880s, about as explicit a declaration of intent as a man could make. The books make this sound charming. The courtship via sleigh. The cold drives across the winter prairie. 2 young people getting to know each other in the particular intimacy that hard weather and long silences create. What the books do not describe is what Laura felt when she was at the Brewster School on a Wednesday evening in February, with a landlady who was difficult to live with, and children who needed more help than one 15-year-old could give them, counting the days until she could go home. She described the Brewster period in Pioneer Girl with the restraint of someone who has decided the truth is too unpleasant to revisit in detail. What she preserved was the sense of obligation, the knowledge that she was there not because she wanted to be, but because Mary needed the tuition, and there was no one else to pay it. This is what poverty does to children. It makes them into adults before the machinery of their childhood is finished running. Laura Ingalls married Almanzo James Wilder on the 25th of August 1885. She was 18 years old. He was 28. The ceremony was in De Smet, small, practical, without the white wedding gown and orange blossoms that more prosperous brides were beginning to expect. Laura wore a black cashmere dress, not a delaine. Not green wool with a strawberry pattern, black cashmere, practical, suitable for future wear. The wardrobe decision of a woman who had grown up watching her mother wrap the one good dress in paper because there was never an occasion worth wearing it for. She married a farmer. She married optimism and debt, and the particular cycle that she had been watching her entire life, and had apparently decided she could not escape, so she might as well lean into. Almanzo had homestead claims north of De Smet. He had purchased farm equipment on credit, a sulky plough, a hay rake, a McCormick binder, and the debt on that equipment sat over their marriage from the first day like a second mortgage on a house they hadn't built yet. The crops failed. Hail, in 1886. Hot, desiccating wind that scorched the wheat before it could head, in 1887. Prairie fire. Drought. The systematic destruction of every agricultural gamble Almanzo made in exactly the way Charles's gamblings had been destroyed, not through bad decisions, exactly, but through the structural impossibility of making 160 acres of Dakota Territory wheat farming work, without reliable water, without capital reserves, and without any protection against the weather that was going to do what the weather was going to do regardless of what a man planted. And then, as if the crop failures were not enough, the disease came. In 1888, both Laura and Almanzo contracted diphtheria. Laura recovered. Almanzo did not entirely. He suffered a stroke that left him with a weakness in his legs that would stay with him for the rest of his life, progressive and permanent, reducing a man who had once driven horses 20 miles across frozen prairie to keep a town alive to someone who needed to lean on things to walk. He was 31 years old. The following year, 1889, their infant son, born that August, unnamed in most historical records, present in the world for only a matter of weeks, died. Their house burned down. Laura Ingalls Wilder was 22 years old. She had a disabled husband, a dead son, a burned house, an outstanding debt for farm equipment that was now ashes, and a crop that had failed. Again. Somewhere in De Smet, in the house on 3rd Street, Caroline read whatever letters Laura sent home. We do not know what those letters said because Caroline left no record of anything. Not of those letters, not of her responses, not of what she felt when the children she had refused to give up, the children she had protected through all of it, began replicating the pattern she knew best. We know Charles was getting old. His farming years were behind him. He worked as a carpenter, as a justice of the peace, as a church elder. He was a known figure in De Smet, respected, liked, the kind of man a community trusts with its small official functions because he is honest and reliable and present. But he was not prosperous. He had never been prosperous. On the 18th of February 1892, Charles Ingalls sold his Dakota homestead. The sale price was $1,200, subject to a mortgage of $760 that he had taken out on the property in 1888. Net profit from the land he had claimed in February 1880, improved for 8 years, proved up on in December 1888, and farmed for the better part of a decade on the open Dakota Prairie, where the wind came straight from Canada with nothing to stop it. Less than $400. That is the number. Less than $400. After 30 years of owning property across 5 states and Dakota Territory, after Wisconsin and Kansas and Minnesota and Iowa and Dakota, after every sunrise and every planting and every harvest that came in or didn't, after every barn he built and every fence he mended, and every government form he signed and every claim he filed and every acre he broke, the total accumulated wealth from all of that land ownership, from all of those fresh starts and new beginnings and horizons with possibilities he could not see yet, was less than $400. He was 56 years old. The trunk had been packed and unpacked across every one of those 30 years. The dress had been wrapped and rewrapped and laid against different walls in different corners of different houses in 6 states and territories. And when he counted his money after the sale, when Charles Ingalls sat with that figure and understood what it represented, there was nothing in the arithmetic that could have surprised Caroline. She had always known. Charles Philip Ingalls died on the 8th of June 1902, in De Smet, in the house he had built, Surrounded by what remained of the family, he had moved 1,000 miles and back again, chasing the promise that the land he was standing on was always, always the wrong land. That the right land was just a little further. That the wandering foot knew something the settled eye did not. He was 66 years old. He left Caroline in the house on 3rd Street with Carrie and Grace, the 2 youngest daughters who had never left home, and the small material residue of a life spent in motion. His tools, his fiddle, the instrument that had made every dark winter and every debt-ridden spring feel, at least for an evening, like something you could survive. A house. And in the house, in a trunk, on paper, the dress. Still there. Still green, or what was left of green after 42 years. Still the only good dress Caroline Ingalls had ever owned in her entire married life. She was 62 years old. She was a widow. She would live another 22 years in that De Smet house, outliving her husband the way women who have spent their lives keeping everything running tend to outlive the men who spent their lives moving. She died on the 20th of April, 1924, at the age of 84, in the town she had been in longer than any other single place in her adult life. The delaine dress its fate, its final destination, where it was on the morning of the 20th of April, 1924, whether it was still in paper or had been opened and refolded not ed one last time, whether it was buried with her or given away or simply worn to nothing in the remaining years after the children were gone and there was no longer any reason to save it, the historical record does not say. Whether it was buried with her in the De Smet cemetery on the 20th of April 1924, where she lies beside the husband whose dreams she followed across a continent and whose failures she translated every day into something her children could survive. Caroline left no letters. Caroline left no diary. Caroline left no will that named the dress specifically. She left nothing but the silence that had always been hers, the silence that Laura had written around in 9 books without ever writing into, and the question that the silence made permanent. Why didn't Laura tell us? Not why didn't Laura describe the dress she described it, once, beautifully, in the first book. Why didn't Laura tell us what the dress meant? Why didn't she write, "My mother wore this dress once in 42 years of marriage"? Why didn't she write, "My mother was fashionable before poverty made fashion irrelevant"? Why didn't she write, "My mother watched everything she was before 1860 get folded up and put away and never taken out again, and she never said a word about it, not once. In all the years I was watching her." Laura Ingalls Wilder was 65 years old when Little House in the Big Woods was published in April 1932. She had been turning her childhood over in her hands for decades by then. She had written and discarded and rewritten. She had a co-author in her corner, her daughter Rose, who was a professional writer of considerable skill and a political ideologue of very specific conviction, and together they had built something. Not a memoir. Something more deliberate than a memoir. Something shaped for an audience of millions, published in the depths of the Great Depression, at the precise historical moment when an entire nation needed to be told that the government was not the answer. Those individuals were the answer. That a family with nothing but each other and the land and their own labour could build a life of dignity and abundance without ever needing a barrel of relief flour, or a midnight escape, or a daughter working for 50 cents a week to keep a blind sister in school. They had built a myth, and the first casualty of that myth was a woman in a dark green dress wrapped in paper at the bottom of a trunk. But to understand exactly how that myth was built, to understand whose hands shaped it, whose ideology drove it, and what specific, deliberate decisions were made about what to include and what to erase, you have to meet Rose Wilder Lane, and you have to understand what she needed her mother's story to say. Because the Little House books were not written in a vacuum. They were written in 1932, in the middle of a national catastrophe, by a woman whose daughter had very strong opinions about what poverty meant, who was responsible for it, and what the American people needed to hear about the frontier in order to believe what Rose needed them to believe. That is the story of Chapter 5, and I need you to be ready for it, because what Rose Wilder Lane did to her grandmother's story, to Caroline's story, to the story of the dress and the relief flower and the midnight flight and the dead baby and the less than $400 homestead, is one of the most extraordinary editorial acts in the history of American literature, and almost nobody talks about it. Don't go anywhere. Rose Wilder was 7 years old when she last saw Dakota Territory. It was 1894, and the landscape she was leaving, the one she had been born into, the one that had shaped her earliest memories, was disappearing behind the wagon in a haze of yellow dust. She would remember that dust for the rest of her life, not as nostalgia, not with the gilded softness that memory sometimes gives to childhood departures, as something else, something closer to a verdict. The Dakota she was leaving had broken her parents. The drought of the early 1890s had finished what the hail and the diphtheria and the burned house and the dead baby had started. Laura and Almanzo Wilder disabled, in debt, childless after all the losses were joining the mass exodus of failed homesteaders streaming off the northern plains. Thousands of people, in wagons and on foot and on whatever transportation they could afford, moving away from land that had destroyed them. The yellow dust followed them for miles. Rose would not forget. And 38 years later, when she sat down to shape her mother's handwritten childhood memoir into a series of books for children, that yellow dust was still there somewhere behind her eyes, somewhere in the part of her mind that had decided, long before she had the vocabulary for it, what the Prairie story was really about. It was not about failure. Rose had decided that already. It was about freedom. The family the 7-year-old Rose was riding away from was not the family of the Little House books. Not yet. Laura and Almanzo Wilder arrived in Mansfield, Missouri, in the summer of 1894, with $100 between them and a daughter who would grow up to reshape American literary and political culture in ways neither of her parents could have predicted. They settled in the Ozarks Hill Country, timbered, nothing like the open prairie, and began again. One more time, in the way that people who have been beginning again their entire lives begin again. Without fanfare, without the luxury of discouragement, with the particular efficiency of people who cannot afford to waste time on what they feel. The farm they built there was called Rocky Ridge. Laura took in boarders. She waited at tables when necessary. She raised chickens and sold eggs and wrote a column for the Missouri Ruralist, a farm newspaper. For years, a column that required her to have opinions and express them clearly, which she did, even though she was not yet thinking of herself as someone who wrote books. Almanzo, his legs permanently weakened by the stroke that had taken him in his late 20s, drove a delivery wagon around Mansfield, hauling fuel and freight. He was a careful, quiet man in this chapter of his life, the kind of man who has been through enough that he does not need to perform his endurance for anyone. They were, still, poor. Not destitute, this is important to say, not fleeing in the night, not grinding grain in a coffee mill, not signing documents describing themselves as wholly without means, but genuinely poor, the way that people in their circumstances were reliably poor, income that covered needs but never quite caught up with the accumulated debt, savings that accumulated slowly and were periodically wiped out, a life of careful management that produced security without comfort. What they did not have, in Mansfield, was their dream anymore. The dream had died in Dakota Territory, in the yellow dust behind the wagon. What they had instead was a farm that worked, a daughter who was terrifyingly intelligent and increasingly far away, and the particular quiet of two people who have survived enough together that they no longer need to explain things to each other. Rose, meanwhile, was not quiet. Rose Wilder left home as soon as leaving was physically possible. She was bright in the specific, restless way of people who have grown up poor and know it, who have looked at the gap between what they have and what they can see as possible, and who have decided, with a completeness that other people might call ambition, but that feels from the inside like survival, that they are going to cross it. She got herself an education. She got herself a telegraph operator's certification. She got herself a job, then another job, then a husband, a marriage that did not last, a surname she kept, Lane. Rose Wilder Lane. By the time she was in her 30s, she was one of the highest paid female writers in America. A journalist, a war correspondent, a woman who had been to the front lines of the First World War, who had written from Albania and Paris and the Balkans, who had lived for a period in a stone farmhouse in the Albanian hills, and written about it for American readers who could not have found Albania on a map. She was extraordinary, and she knew it. And she worked in the specific way that people who grew up watching their parents fail tend to work, with a focus and a relentlessness that looked to outsiders like talent, but was, from the inside, more like something chasing her. In the mid-1920s, Rose travelled to the Soviet Union. She went as a correspondent to observe and report on the great social experiment of collectivization, the Soviet government's program of organizing agriculture into collective farms, promising efficiency and abundance, delivering something considerably different. She travelled through the countryside. She talked to farmers. She watched what happened when a government told people how to use their land, what to grow, how to distribute what they grew, what they were permitted to keep. What she saw broke something open in her. The farmers she talked to were not merely poor. They were people who had been separated from their agency, from the ability to make decisions about their own labour, their own land, their own futures. And something in that image, something specific and visceral in the experience of talking to people who had been stripped of the capacity to determine their own economic fate, connected in Rose's mind to something she had been carrying since childhood, since a yellow dust day in 1894 on a Dakota road, since every night she had watched her mother make do, since every morning she had understood, at the age of children understand things without being told, that her family's poverty was not an accident or a failure but a condition, something imposed, something structural, something that was being done to them. She came home from the Soviet Union, a libertarian, not as a political affiliation, not yet, as a conviction, as the kind of belief that forms around a wound and becomes indistinguishable from the wound itself. The belief that freedom, individual freedom, the freedom to own your labour and your land and the products of both, without a government or a collective or any external authority deciding what you could have and what you had to give away, was the only thing that separated a life from a sentence. This belief would, within a few years, reshape the way millions of Americans remembered their pioneer past. By 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old. In October of 1929, the stock market had crashed, and with it whatever modest financial security the Wilders had accumulated in their Missouri years. Laura had invested in stocks the way that people who have been poor their whole lives invest in stocks when they finally have enough money to invest, with a particular anxious hope of someone who has never had a cushion and desperately needs one. The crash took that cushion. At 62 years old, Laura Wilder was financially diminished again, back to the kind of careful accounting that had been the whole texture of her life before the column income and the modest Ozarks prosperity. She had been thinking about writing a book for years. Now she had a reason that went beyond thinking. She sat down at the table at Rocky Ridge Farm and she wrote, in pencil, in school tablets, in the handwriting of a woman who had always been careful with paper because paper cost money. She wrote about her childhood, about Wisconsin, about Kansas, about Plum Creek and the grasshoppers and the hard winter and the years in De Smet. She wrote what she remembered, which was a great deal. Laura had always remembered everything. And she wrote it as memoir, in the first person, in the voice of the woman she had actually been. This manuscript, handwritten in those school tablets, running to hundreds of pages, was called Pioneer Girl. And Pioneer Girl contained things that the Little House books do not. It contained Burr Oak, Iowa, the hotel partnership, the house near the saloon, the midnight wagon, the debts left behind. It contained Freddie, briefly, painfully, without the detail that might have made it bearable, but his name was there. His existence was there. He had lived, and he had died, and Laura knew it and wrote it. It contained the county relief flower, the fact that the family had accepted assistance, the barrel of government provisions that had kept them alive during the Grasshopper years. It contained the offer to adopt Laura, the doctor's wife, the refusal, all of it. It contained, in other words, the truth. Not the polished truth of retrospective meaning-making, not the truth dressed up and ready for children's literature, just the truth. The accumulated, difficult, imperfectly remembered, but honestly presented truth of a childhood lived inside poverty, on the edges of failure, in the company of parents who were doing their best and often not succeeding. Laura sent Pioneer Girl to literary agents. They sent it back. Publishers looked at it and passed. The book was too long, too episodic, not quite memoir and not quite fiction. It had no clear audience. It didn't fit the category of what was selling in 1930 and 1931, which was, in the depths of the worst economic crisis in American history, a specific kind of comfort, not truth. Comfort. The kind of story that made people feel that hard times could survive, that the past had heroes in it, that things would be all right. Pioneer Girl, with its midnight escapes and dead babies and government flour, was not that story. Rose looked at the rejections, and she understood the problem immediately. She was a professional. She had been writing for commercial audiences for 20 years. She knew what readers wanted, what editors wanted, what the market would absorb. And she knew something else. She knew that her mother's memories, properly shaped, stripped of their complications, focused and tightened and reframed, were extraordinary. There was material here for something that would last. She could see it. The question was, what to take out, what to keep, and what to transform. She got to work. The first decision was about audience. Pioneer Girl was an adult memoir. The Little House books would be children's literature, a genre with specific conventions, specific constraints, and specific commercial rewards. Reframing for children requires simplification. Darkness that could not be made meaningful for a 10-year-old reader had to go. Complexity that required adult context had to go. The grinding, cumulative quality of real poverty, the way it wears a person down, not through dramatic events, but through the relentless daily arithmetic of not having enough. That texture had to be smoothed into something more episodic, more cheerful, more survivable. This is where most defenders of the Little House books stop the argument. They say, Rose was editing for a children's audience. The changes were necessary for the genre. You cannot write about a dead baby in a book for 8-year-olds. You cannot describe a family's midnight flight from creditors to children who are trying to go to sleep feeling safe. The omissions were practical, aesthetic, the reasonable choices of professional writers working in a specific literary form. And there is truth in that argument. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain why the family's receipt of government relief flour was removed from every single book. Not just the dark parts, not just the emotionally overwhelming passages, but any reference, however brief, to the fact that the county had helped them survive. Children's literature is not incapable of portraying assistance. What it was apparently incapable of, in Rose's hands, was portraying government assistance. It does not explain why Charles's multiple departures, the times he walked away from the family to find work elsewhere, the times the family was functionally headed by Caroline alone for months, were consistently transformed into brief, purposeful absences that never interrupted the narrative of a present protective father. It does not explain why the Burr Oak period was not just shortened or simplified, but entirely erased 2 full years of the family's life, containing events that could have been written around. Laura herself later acknowledged that Burr Oak was left out, and the explanation she gave that she wanted the story to feel coherent and unbroken does not quite account for the surgical completeness of the erasure. To explain those things, you need to understand what Rose believed, not what she believed about children's literature, what she believed about government. Rose Wilder Lane was, by the early 1930s, in the process of becoming one of the most influential political thinkers in the American libertarian tradition. She would later be identified, alongside Ayn Rand and Isabel Patterson, as one of the 3 founding mothers of modern American libertarianism, the intellectual women who, in the years surrounding the Second World War, built the philosophical scaffolding for a political movement that would reshape American conservatism. Her 1943 book, The Discovery of Freedom, is considered a foundational libertarian text, as important to that tradition as any single work by a man. But in 1931 and 1932, she was not yet writing political theory. She was editing her mother's childhood memories. And she was editing them during the Great Depression. During the year that Franklin Roosevelt was elected president on a platform of federal intervention, the New Deal, the programs designed to use government resources to relieve suffering on a national scale. During the year that millions of Americans were standing in breadlines, losing farms, losing jobs, losing the thin margin that separated them from destitution, and looking toward Washington for help. Rose looked at Washington and felt something very close to terror. She believed not as a political position, but as a visceral, physical conviction, the kind that comes from watching Soviet collectivization reduce farmers to dependency, that what was coming from Washington was not salvation, but the first step towards servitude. That every program, every subsidy, every relief barrel was a link in a chain. That the Americans who accepted government help were surrendering something they would not get back. That the pioneer story, her family's story, her grandmother's story was proof that it didn't have to be this way. That people could survive, that families could endure, that the frontier had been won by individuals who needed nothing from Washington except to be left alone. This belief required a story, and the story required editing. The specific act I want you to understand the moment I think is the most revealing in the entire editorial history of the Little House books is not the erasure of Burr Oak. It is not the removal of Freddie. It is not even the deletion of the county relief flower, though that particular omission is the one with the most obvious political motivation. The most revealing act is what happened to the delaine dress after the first book. In Little House in the Big Woods, published April 1932, the first book in the series, Laura described the dress. The green wool, the strawberry pattern, the red buttons, the whalebone seams. She described Ma wearing it to the sugaring off dance at Grandpa's house. She described it as beautiful. The passage is one of the loveliest in the book, a warm, intimate memory of a mother's elegance, a daughter's admiration, a family's rare moment of festivity. The description was, taken alone, charming and affecting, but it was also, to anyone paying close attention, a grenade. Because the dress existed in Little House in the Big Woods as a lovely detail from the early Wisconsin years not yet weighted with everything that would come after. The reader of that first book did not know about Kansas, or the grasshoppers, or Burr Oak, or the hard winter. They did not know that the dress would never be replaced. They did not know that the woman wearing it at that sugaring dance was wearing the only fine garment she would ever own, that the momentary elegance captured in that passage was not a glimpse of Ma's natural state, but a single exception in a lifetime of deprivation. If the dress appeared in subsequent books, if Laura had written, in On the Banks of Plum Creek, or By the Shores of Silver Lake, or The Long Winter, a single sentence that noted Ma still had only the one good dress, that she had never gotten another, the meaning of the original passage would have shifted entirely. It would have become a document of poverty rather than a charm of pioneer simplicity. So, the dress did not appear again. 8 more books, 32 years of the family's life from the Wisconsin Big Woods through the Dakota Territory homestead years. 8 more chances for Laura to return to the image she had introduced so beautifully and give it its true weight. She never did. Whether that was Laura's decision or Rose's, or whether the distinction mattered by the time the books were being written, is something historians continue to debate. The manuscript evidence Rose's editorial marks, the letters between mother and daughter, has been studied carefully by scholars including Pamela Smith-Hill and Caroline Fraser, and the consensus is that the books were genuinely collaborative. Laura's memories, Rose's craft, both women's decisions about what the story needed to be, what the story needed the dress to be, was a detail, not a symbol, not a ledger entry in a lifetime's accounting of deprivation, a detail. A charming, feminine, nostalgic detail that signalled Ma's innate refinement and grace, then gracefully retired. And that is exactly what it became. Meanwhile, as the books were being written through the 1930s and into the early 1940s, Rose was also producing her political journalism. She was writing articles and essays and letters to her mother, letters to her editors, letters to everyone who would engage with her about what she saw happening to America under the New Deal. She described the Roosevelt administration's programs as a drift toward collectivism, toward the same system she had watched eat the life out of Soviet farmers in the 1920s. She and Laura exchanged correspondence in which they described government assistance in terms that would have shocked anyone who knew that these 2 women's family had survived on government relief flour in Minnesota, had lived in a house subsidized by railroad infrastructure in Dakota Territory, had filed a claim under the Homestead Act, the largest federal land subsidy in American history. The books that were making them famous and eventually making them wealthy were, in the view of the women who wrote them, proof that none of that had been necessary. Families like the Ingalls didn't need the flour barrel, that they didn't need the railroad infrastructure, that the American pioneer was, by nature and by choice, sufficient unto herself. Here is the irony that is almost too sharp to look at directly. The woman whose grandmother had one dress for 42 years of marriage, because the economics of the frontier had made a second dress impossible, that woman was being held up in 9 volumes of beloved children's literature as evidence that the frontier economy worked, that it was fair, that it rewarded the people who deserved reward, that the people who struggled did so because of circumstance and weather and the ordinary adversity of a difficult world, not because of structures that were specifically designed to produce their failure. Caroline Ingalls, who had no legal identity under coverture, who had no right to vote or own property or make economic decisions, who had watched her husband exercise every prerogative of frontier manhood and produce. In 30 years of property ownership, a net profit of less than $440, Caroline was being offered to the American public as a portrait of self-sufficient pioneer womanhood. The dress was in the trunk. The books were in every library in America. Little House in the Big Woods was published in April 1932 and received with immediate, genuine affection. It was named a Newbery Honor Book. It was sold. The subsequent volumes, each one covering a new period of the family's life, each one carefully managed to present hardship as adventure and failure as temporary setbacks, sold too. By the late 1930s, Laura Ingalls Wilder was a celebrity. She received fan mail, she was asked to give speeches. She was, for the first time in her 60-plus years, financially comfortable. She bought new clothes. That fact that the woman who had written her mother's one good dress into American mythology as a charming pioneer keepsake went out, with her first real royalty money, and bought herself nice things, has the quality of a historical joke so dark that it almost makes you want to stop laughing. She had been describing poverty her entire adult life, and the description had finally made her enough money to leave it behind. She was in her late 60s. She had her whole financial life to reconstruct, and she did it with the focused enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting a very long time to stop making do. Laura died in 1957, 90 years old, at Rocky Ridge Farm, having outlived almost everyone who had been in her childhood, having published 9 books that would never go out of print, having received more fan mail than she could answer, having described a childhood that was real and not real, simultaneously a childhood built on true memories and true emotions, shaped by a daughter's ideology and a generation's political needs into something that served purposes its subjects had never intended. Rose Wilder Lane died in 1968. She never publicly acknowledged the full extent of her editorial role. She never wrote the account that scholars would later assemble from manuscript evidence, from letters, from the archive she left at the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa. She never said, "I removed the government flour. I erased the Iowa years. I turned my grandmother's poverty into a myth of self-sufficiency because I needed it to mean something other than what it meant." She took that knowledge with her. For decades after that, the Little House books were simply what they appeared to be. Children read them in school. Teachers assigned them. The American Library Association awarded them the highest honors it could give to children's literature. In 1974, a television series turned Pa into an icon of frontier fatherhood, and Ma into a figure of such polished composure that anyone who knew the historical record would have recognized her as a different woman, entirely a woman who had been created not from Caroline Ingalls' life, but from the needs of a television audience that wanted comfort, not truth. The book said, pioneers didn't need the government. The book said, hard work and family were sufficient. The book said, the frontier was hard but fair, and the families who endured it endured because of what they carried inside them. And nobody said, wait, what was in the trunk? Not for a very long time. But someone was already looking. In 1993, a scholar named William Holtz published The Ghost in the Little House, a biography of Rose Wilder Lane. What Holtz found in the manuscript evidence, in the editorial marks, in the letters, in the detailed comparison of what Laura wrote and what got published, was not a daughter helping her mother polish a memoir. It was something considerably more complicated, a writer of considerable professional skill reshaping her mother's raw material according to a literary and political vision that was, in significant ways, Rose's own. The seams were visible once you knew where to look. And once the seams were visible, the scholars came. There was a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography coming. There was an annotated edition of Pioneer Girl, coming the manuscript that showed, side by side, what Laura actually wrote and what ended up in the books. There was a reckoning with a story that had been told one way for 60 years and was about to be told another way entirely. But before we get to that reckoning, before we get to the scholars and the manuscripts and the archive that finally gave historians the tools to say what had been done, I need to take you to one more place. I need to take you to the question that all of this was always circling. Not, what did Rosa raise? We know what Rosa raised. You know it now. You have known it since chapter 2. The real question, the one that none of the scholars quite asked directly, because scholars are trained to be careful about questions that cannot be definitively answered, is this. Did Caroline know? Did Caroline Ingalls know, in the years between 1902, when Charles died, and 1924, when she died? No. She died in 1924. She never read the books. She died 8 years before they were published. She died with the trunk, with the paper, with the dress in whatever condition. 44 years of careful preservation had left it. She never read what her daughter wrote about her. She never read the passage about the sugaring off dance, the green wool, the red buttons. She never read the 8 subsequent books in which the dress did not appear. She never read the version of herself that 60 million people would come to know the cheerful, composed, relentlessly capable pioneer mother who managed every hardship with grace and never, not once, showed the crack in her foundation. She never knew that her daughter had loved her enough to write about her, and not enough to tell the truth about her. She never knew that the one good dress she spent 42 years keeping in paper was going to become, in the hands of a daughter and a granddaughter and the American publishing industry, a charming detail. That is the last thing we need to understand before this story can be complete. And chapter 6 is where we understand it. Stay with me. Let's go back to William Holtz. 1993. He was a professor at the University of Missouri and had spent years tracking down Rose Wilder Lane's letters, diaries, manuscripts, and editorial correspondence documents scattered across multiple archives, most significantly the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library in Iowa, where Rose's papers eventually landed. Holtz was not a fan of the Little House books in the sentimental way that most people who write about them tend to be. He was a biographer, which means his job was to follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was comfortable. The evidence led somewhere very specific. When Holtz laid the original manuscripts alongside the published books, when he put, side by side, what Laura had written in her handwritten tablets and what eventually appeared on the printed page, he found a pattern that was too systematic to be edited and too deliberate to be revision. He found a disappearing act. The specific finding that matters most for our purposes is not the removal of the Burr Oak period, which we already know about, or the erasure of the government relief flower, which we already know about. The finding that stops you cold is what happened to the family's emotional register. In Laura's original manuscripts, her raw, unfiltered recollections, there are passages where Charles Ingalls is frightened, where Caroline is exhausted, where the family is not managing cheerfully through adversity, but is genuinely, visibly desperate. Passages where the tone is not "this was hard, but we got through it," but "this was destroying us and we did not know if we would survive." Those passages vanished from the published books. Not shortened, not reframed, vanished. What Holtz documented was not merely editorial selection, the normal shaping of any memoir into publishable form. What he documented was the systematic removal of any emotional honesty that contradicted the ideological message. And the ideological message was specific and consistent. Pioneers were self-sufficient, cheerful, and strong. They did not fall apart, they did not despair. They did not need anyone outside the family. They especially did not need the government. That was the book. That was what sold. That was what 40 million American children absorbed, sitting in school libraries in the decades between 1932 and 1993, believing they were reading history. Now here is what I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. By 1993, by the time Holtz published The Ghost in the Little House, The Little House books had been in print for 61 years. They had received the American Library Association's highest honors. They had been taught in public schools across the country as authentic accounts of pioneer life. The television series had run for 9 seasons on NBC. And in all of that time, in all of those classrooms and libraries and living rooms, nobody with access to a mainstream audience had said, loudly and clearly, these books are not what they appear to be. Scholars had been whispering it for years. Feminist historians and literary critics had been picking at the edges of the myth since the 1970s. But the popular understanding, the understanding that shaped how millions of ordinary Americans thought about pioneer life, about poverty, about the role of government, about whether hard-working people should need help, that understanding was undisturbed. The myth was intact, and the myth had done its work. By 1993, Ronald Reagan had cited the pioneer spirit as justification for cutting federal assistance programs. By 1993, the phrase, "pull yourself up by your bootstraps," had been used so many thousands of times in American political discourse that most people had forgotten it was originally said as a joke, because bootstraps are literally what you pull on to put boots on, not to levitate yourself off the ground. By 1993, the idea that self-reliance was the defining American virtue and government dependence was a personal moral failing was so deeply embedded in American political culture that it felt like common sense. And somewhere underneath all of that, propping it up, giving it narrative shape and emotional warmth, and the authority of childhood memory, was a series of 9 children's books in which a family that had survived on government relief was presented as the proof that government relief was unnecessary. The seams were visible once you looked. Most people still weren't looking. That changed in 2014. In June of that year, the South Dakota State Historical Society Press published Pioneer Girl, the annotated autobiography, edited by Pamela Smith Hill. It was, in the language of archival scholarship, a critical edition Laura's original handwritten manuscript placed on the page alongside Hill's meticulous annotations, documenting every significant difference between what Laura wrote and what appeared in the published books. The book sold out its first print run within days. Not because academics rushed to buy it, they did, but there aren't enough academics to sell out a print run in days. It sold out because ordinary readers, many of them women who had grown up with the Little House books, who had loved them, who had read them to their own children, who had a specific and tender relationship with the image of Ma setting the table beautifully in a dugout house, and Pa playing the fiddle through a blizzard, those women wanted to see what was underneath. What they found in Hill's annotations was a story that ran parallel to the one they knew and was, in almost every way, harder. Laura had written about her fear, about the times the family had genuinely not known if they would eat, about the doctor's bills they couldn't pay and the school terms the girls missed, and the periods when Charles was absent and Caroline was managing alone with children, and no income and no certainty about when things would improve. About the nights Laura had lain awake, listening to her parents talk in low voices about money, the specific, particular sound of 2 adults calculating whether there was enough and calculating wrong. In the published books, those nights don't exist. In the published books, the darkness is always temporary. The fear is always surmountable. The family always wakes up to a morning that feels manageable, even bright. Ma's face, when she turns from the stove to face her daughters, always has the composed expression of a woman who has decided that composure is what the situation requires. And here is the thing about composure. It is a real skill. It is a real gift to a child who needs to believe that her parents can handle what is happening. Laura was not wrong to notice her mother's composure and admire it and remember it. That composure was genuine. Caroline Ingalls did, by every account, maintain an extraordinary steadiness under conditions that would have broken a less disciplined person. But composure is not the same as contentment. And the books, in replacing Caroline's composure with contentment in presenting her steadiness as evidence that she was fine, that the poverty wasn't really that bad, that the frontier was hard but richly rewarding, did something Caroline's composure itself never did. They lied. Before I take you to the Pulitzer Prize, I need to stop here for a moment and tell you something about the books that most people who grew up loving them genuinely do not know. Because the book's erasure of poverty and government assistance is one problem. But there is another problem, and it is one that the American Library Association finally, officially, could not ignore in 2018. In the second book in the series, Little House on the Prairie, published in 1935, there is a scene in which the family encounters Osage people passing near their cabin. Laura records what her mother said about them. Ma said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." That sentence is in the book. It has been in the book since 1935. It was in the book that the American Library Association gave their highest award to the award they named after Laura Ingalls Wilder for decades. Pa disagrees with Ma in the scene. He says that isn't right. And defenders of the books have sometimes pointed to Pa's disagreement as evidence that the line is morally complicated rather than simply racist. But here is what those defenders miss. Caroline Ingalls was living on land that belonged to the Osage Nation. Her family was there illegally. The Osage people she called "the only good Indian is a dead Indian" were the legal owners of the ground her family had planted a garden in and built a cabin on and called home. And they were exercising astonishing restraint in allowing the white families who had flooded their reserve to continue living there at all, while the federal government did the slow paperwork of removing the nation from its own territory. That's the context. And the books, which were written by women who had direct experience of what the federal government's land policy actually meant for the families on both sides of it, did not provide that context. Not for children, not in a way that made the complexity visible. They provided a scene of Osage people moving through the landscape of Laura's childhood memory, described from the perspective of a small girl who had absorbed her mother's fear and had not yet would not, in the published books, ever developed the analytical framework to interrogate it. In June of 2018, after years of pressure from Indigenous scholars, educators and community members, the American Library Association Board voted to rename the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award. The award had been established in 1954. It had carried Laura's name for 64 years. The board announced that the books contained dated cultural attitudes toward Indigenous people and people of colour that are inconsistent with ALSC's core values. The award was renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The reaction was immediate and polarised. Many people celebrated. Many people were furious. The debate that followed about whether to rename an award is censorship, whether it constitutes erasing literary history, whether the book's racism is separable from their literary merit was real and genuine and not easily resolved. What did not happen in that debate, in most mainstream coverage, was this. Nobody noted that the racism was not the only problem, that the Little House books had another systematic distortion embedded in them, one that had affected at least as many lives as the racist imagery. The distortion that said, "The poor don't need help." That said, the government is an obstacle, not a resource. That said, a family like the Ingalls, chronically indebted, repeatedly displaced, surviving on relief flour and county charity, was proof that individual effort was sufficient. The ALA looked at the books and saw racism. They saw it, they named it, they acted on it. But the poverty myth, the one that had shaped American political debate for 90 years, was not part of the announcement. Caroline's dress was still in the paper. The year before the ALA vote, in 2017, a journalist and historian named Caroline Fraser published a book called Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. In April 2018, Prairie Fires won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. What Fraser did that no one had done before, not with the thoroughness, not with the scope, not with the relentless follow-through on primary source evidence, was place the Ingalls family's experience inside the full structural context of American homesteading. Not just their story. Everyone's story. The data on how many families filed homestead claims and how many families actually proved up and kept the land. The records of crop failures and bank collapses and the 1890s drought that drove a mass exodus off the northern plains. The railroad company records that documented, in precise financial language, exactly how much money was made by the companies that sold the propaganda. Charles Ingalls and thousands like him had believed. The picture Fraser assembled was devastating. The Homestead Act was, as an agricultural program for poor families, a near-total failure. The families who succeeded were those with capital enough money to buy equipment, hire labor, weather a bad season without losing everything. The families who failed, who defaulted, who fled, who sold for whatever they could get, and walked away from 30 years of labor with less than they had started with, were the families who had nothing when they arrived and needed the land to be everything. The Ingalls were not exceptional in their failure. They were typical. They were the majority. The frontier story that Americans had told themselves for 150 years, the story of the rugged individual making good on free land through nothing but hard work and determination, was a story about a minority of people who happened to have the capital and the luck to survive. The majority, the people who failed, were buried in the data. They were the silent footnote to the triumphant narrative. And the most famous family in that silent footnote had a daughter who turned their failure into the proof that failure was impossible. There is one more layer here that I have not yet named directly, because it took me this long in the story to get to the place where it lands with the weight it deserves. In 1860, when Caroline Quiner became Caroline Ingalls, she ceased to exist. Not metaphorically. Legally. The doctrine of coverture, which governed the legal status of married women in the United States for most of the 19th century, held that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not sue or be sued. She could not sign contracts. She could not own property in her own name. She could not control her own wages. She could not vote. She could not make any legal or financial decision independently. Her economic fate was entirely, completely, and without exception determined by the choices of the man she had married. Every move the family made from Wisconsin to Kansas, from Kansas back to Wisconsin, from Wisconsin to Minnesota, from Minnesota to Iowa, from Iowa back to Minnesota, from Minnesota to Dakota Territory was Charles's decision. Not a decision they made together, not a decision Caroline endorsed as an equal partner, but a decision Charles made that Caroline had no legal standing to contest, that she followed because she had no other option, because the law had made her options identical to his. She was 39 years old when they moved to Dakota Territory. She had been married for 20 years. She had lived in 6 places. She had buried a child. She had been woken in the middle of the night and loaded into a wagon in the dark. She had accepted government charity. She had sent her daughter to work in a stranger's kitchen. And in all of that time, in all of those years and all of those moves and all of those mornings when she got up and made breakfast and kept the household running, she had absolutely no legal power to say, "No. We are not moving again. We are staying here. I am not loading the trunk one more time." The dress sat in that trunk for 42 years because Caroline Ingalls had no legal authority over her own life. Not because she lacked the will to want something different, because the law had decided she didn't exist. The Little House books written in the 1930s by a woman and her daughter, published for an audience of American girls, celebrated as portraits of pioneering womanhood, contain exactly 0 pages of reflection on this reality. 0. In 9 books, spanning 3,000 pages of frontier life. The legal non-existence of the woman at the center of those books is never mentioned. The word coverture does not appear. The reality that Caroline Ingalls had no right to own the dresses she didn't have, no right to refuse the moves she didn't want to make, no right to any economic decision about her own survival. This reality is as absent from the books as the dress itself, because you cannot write honestly about Ma's one good dress without writing about why she only had one, and you cannot write about why she only had one without confronting what the law said about who she was. And you cannot confront what the law said about who she was and still maintain the myth of the pioneer family as a unit of free, self-sufficient, equal partners working the land together. The myth required her silence. In the books and before the law, it got both. And yet, here is what I find myself returning to every time I sit with all of this, every time I follow the thread from the scholarship back to the woman. Caroline kept the dress. For 42 years, through 6 states, 6 houses, 6 fresh starts and 6 accumulations of loss. Through the Grasshopper years and the Burr Oak nights and the hard winter and the proving up and the sale and Charles's death and her own widowhood, She kept it wrapped in paper, protected from moths and light and the rough handling of a life that did not have time for careful things. She kept it. That is not the act of a woman who had stopped believing she deserved fine things. That is not the act of a woman who had accepted, without resistance, the full reduction of herself that her circumstances demanded. Keeping the dress, maintaining it, protecting it, carrying it across the continent in the bottom of a trunk was an act of preservation. Of self. Of the woman she had been at 20 and still was, underneath everything the frontier had asked her to become. The dress was not a relic. It was a declaration. And the fact that no one wrote about that declaration, that Laura described the dress once and moved on, that Rose edited for a message that had no room for the weight of it, that the American Library Association celebrated the books for 64 years, without asking what the dress meant, that fact does not make the declaration less real. It makes it more urgent. Because the only way Caroline's declaration finally gets heard is if someone finds the courage to ask the question that was always there, wrapped in paper, waiting. The question that Chapter 7 is going to answer. Not, what happened to the dress? The dress is gone. The outline says so. The historians say so. The museums have been asked, and they don't have it. It is not in Mansfield. It is not in De Smet. It is not in any collection anywhere in the United States that has been publicly catalogued. Whatever remained of that dark green wool and those red buttons and those whalebone seams, after 64 years of careful keeping followed by 22 years of a widow's solitary house, it is gone. Worn to threads perhaps. Sold perhaps. Buried with her. We will never know. What we can answer, what we owe it to her to try to answer, is this. Who was Caroline Ingalls, stripped of the myth her daughter built around her? Not the cheerful, composed pioneer mother. Not the figure on the television screen in calico and a sensible bun. Not the ideological prop in a libertarian argument about self-sufficiency. Not the absence at the centre of 9 children's books. The woman. The teacher who married a carpenter's son on a February morning and put on a beautiful dress and said yes, not knowing what yes meant. Who was she? That's Chapter 7, and I am not going to make you wait for it. She could have written it herself. That is the thing almost no one says about Caroline Ingalls, and it is the thing I keep coming back to, the detail that changes the entire shape of the story when you hold it up to the light. Caroline Quiner had been a schoolteacher. Before the marriage, before the trunk, before the dress was wrapped in paper and the life it belonged to was wrapped alongside it, Caroline Lake Quiner stood in a classroom in Concord, Wisconsin, and taught. She was literate at a time when literacy among women was not guaranteed. She was numerate. She had opinions about learning and the transmission of knowledge, because you cannot teach without having them. She had read. She had engaged with ideas. She had the specific, practical relationship with written language that only people who have used it professionally possess. She knew how sentences worked. She had the tools to record her own life, is what I'm saying. Not just the mechanical ability to form letters on a page. She had the intelligence, the vocabulary, and the framework that memoir requires. She could have been her own witness. She could have written the account that would have made everything you've heard in this documentary unnecessary, because she could have told it herself. She didn't. She left nothing. No diary, no letters, no journal entries, no scattered pages in any archive anywhere in the United States. The woman at the centre of one of the most thoroughly documented families in American literary history is also the most thoroughly silent. Everyone around her spoke. Charles spoke through Laura's portrayal of him, through his homestead filings, through legal documents and census records. Laura spoke through 3,000 pages of memoir and fiction. Rose spoke through letters and diaries and published books and political essays. Even the county of Redwood, Minnesota, has records that speak about the Ingalls family, the relief document, the land assessments, the tax records. Caroline is not in any of them in her own voice. Not once. The question historians ask is, why? The most obvious answer is time. Caroline Ingalls' daily labour in the conditions of frontier poverty left no hours for reflection. She rose before dawn. She cooked on a wood stove that required fuel to be gathered or cut before it could be lit. She washed clothes by hand, hauling water, heating it, scrubbing, wringing, hanging, ironing, in an era before the technology that makes this sequence take 45 minutes. She sewed. Not for pleasure. For necessity. Every garment worn by 5 children in a household, with almost no money for ready-made clothing, had to be constructed, maintained, repaired, and eventually repurposed. She gardened, she made cheese, she put up preserves, she managed, on inadequate resources, the nutritional requirements of a family that was frequently on the edge of not having enough to eat. A 2009 University of Vermont study estimated that a 19th century farm woman performing standard household tasks worked approximately 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no paid vacation, no sick days, and no retirement. That estimate is probably conservative for a family in the Ingalls circumstances, where the poverty added work rather than reducing it, where you couldn't buy the bread so you had to bake it, couldn't buy the curtains so you had to sew them, couldn't hire the help so you had to be it. Caroline had no time to write. But that is not the whole answer, because women with less education than Caroline found time, in the 19th century, to keep diaries. Pioneer women whose daily labour was every bit as crushing as hers left written records. The absence of Caroline's voice is not simply a matter of hours. It is a matter of who the culture told to speak and who it told to be quiet. Caroline Ingalls lived in a world that did not ask women, especially poor women, especially women defined entirely by their domestic roles, to record their inner lives. The idea that what a woman felt while scrubbing laundry was worth putting on paper, that her observations about poverty and faith and love and disappointment and the specific texture of a life lived always on the edge of loss, the idea that any of that was worth preserving was not something the 19th century American Midwest offered to women like her. It offered it to their husbands. It offered it to their daughters, if their daughters happened to be remarkable in specific ways. It offered it to the women of the educated East, the women of leisure, the women who had time and cultural permission and a sense that their interiority mattered to anyone beyond themselves. Caroline did not have that permission, and here is the most shattering part of her silence. She probably knew her experience didn't matter to anyone who could do anything about it. She had no legal recourse to change her circumstances. She had no political voice. She had no platform. She was covered by coverture and silenced by culture. Simultaneously, the law erased her legal existence and the culture erased her inner one. So she kept the dress instead. She wrapped it in paper and put it at the bottom of the trunk and carried it across 6 states as proof that she had once existed as a woman with choices and beauty and possibility. The dress was her diary. The dress was the only record she left of the person she had been before the frontier took her name and made it footnote to someone else's story. Now I want to tell you about Mary. Because people who know the Little House books know the broad outline of Mary Ingalls' story. The illness, the blindness, the Iowa College for the Blind, the sacrifice Laura made to pay for it. They know that Mary went to school. What they often don't know is what happened after. Mary Ingalls graduated from the Iowa College for the Blind. She learned to read Braille. She learned to make intricate needlework with her hands, working entirely by touch. She became, within the constraints her blindness imposed, genuinely accomplished. The education she received, the education funded by her younger sister's wages as a teenage teacher, was real and thorough. And then she came home. She came back to De Smet, South Dakota, and she lived there, with the family, in the family household. She contributed what she could, the needlework, the domestic presence, the Braille reading, the quiet competence of a woman who had made her peace with limits. She never married. She never had an independent household. The world of the 1880s and 1890s simply did not have a place for a blind woman of modest means outside of her family of origin. Mary Ingalls died on the 20th of January 1928. She was 63 years old. She died in De Smet, in a boarding house that her sister Carrie was running. Think about the specific geometry of that death for a moment. A woman who had received a real education, who had the intellectual capacity for a life of the mind, who had been sent to school precisely so that she would have more than her mother's life dying in her sister's boarding house at 63, the same De Smet she had returned to 40 years earlier, having never once in all those decades left the orbit of family necessity. The sacrifice Laura made for her sister was genuine and costly, but the sacrifice did not purchase freedom. It purchased education in a world that had no use for an educated blind woman without capital. The education was a gift. What surrounded the gift was a trap. Carrie Ingalls, Caroline Celestia, the third daughter, found a different escape route. She became a journalist. She worked for newspapers in De Smet and in the surrounding communities, setting type and writing copy. She became a printer. In 1912, at the age of 41, she married a widower named David Swansea and moved to the Black Hills of South Dakota, where she spent the remainder of her life. By the standards of women of her background and era, Carrie's life was relatively independent. She had a skill, she had an income, she had a community. But Carrie was described throughout her life as fragile. The word appears in multiple accounts: fragile health, fragile constitution, fragile in ways that family members attributed to her difficult early childhood. The childhood of inadequate food, of cold houses, of the specific physical toll that extreme poverty imposes on a growing body. The frontier years left a mark on Carrie that her competence and her journalism and her eventual modest stability could not entirely undo. Grace Ingalls, the youngest, born in Burr Oak in the year of the Midnight Escape, married a farmer named Nate Dow in 1901. She lived in Manchester, South Dakota. She died in 1941. She left fewer traces in the historical record than any of her surviving sisters, which is saying something. Grace is the most thoroughly erased of the Ingalls daughters. Even the revisionist scholarship that has done so much to recover the family's real history has relatively little to say about her. She lived. She farmed. She died. Her mother's life in miniature, compressed into 40 years and a small South Dakota community. 4 daughters, 4 lives shaped by the poverty of their childhood in ways that no amount of frontier mythology can obscure. Mary, brilliant and educated, and permanently dependent. Carrie, competent and fragile and still carrying the physical cost of her early years. Grace, nearly invisible. And Laura, the one who got out, who got famous, who got money at 65, and bought nice clothes and answered fan mail and died at 90. And all of them, in some way, still living inside the story their mother was never allowed to tell. Here is what I want to say about Laura, because this documentary has been asking hard questions about what she did, and I think she deserves something more than the verdict of an ideological prosecutor. Laura was 7 years old when her baby brother died, and her family fled Minnesota. She was 9 years old when she was wakened in darkness and placed in a wagon because her parents were fleeing creditors. She was 10 years old when she went to work in a stranger's kitchen. She was a child. She absorbed everything: the fear, the desperation, the specific sound of her parents talking about money in low voices at night, and she had no framework for it yet. She had no language for structural economic failure, no understanding of the Homestead Act's design flaws, no analysis of the railroad propaganda that had lured her father to each new disaster. She only had what children have: experience without interpretation, memory without context. And then, decades later, she was asked to make it into a book. Not a book about poverty, not a book about government failure and corporate exploitation and the death of a baby and the midnight flight from debt. A book for children. A book that would sell. A book that people, real people in the middle of the Great Depression, people who needed something to believe, would want to read. Laura was not a villain. She was a traumatized daughter who loved her mother and did not know how to love her honestly, who described a woman's courage without describing what the courage cost, who remembered a dress and wrote about it beautifully, and then spent the rest of the books not writing about it, because writing about it again would have required telling the truth about what the one dress meant. There is a particular kind of grief in that, the grief of people who love someone and cannot bear to let the world see how much that person suffered. The grief of children who witnessed a parent's pain and could not fix it, and who spent their adult lives rewriting the pain into something more bearable, more purposeful, more meaningful than it actually was. Laura rewrote her mother's suffering into nobility. That is an act of love. It is also an act of erasure. And both things are true at the same time, and the tragedy is that one doesn't cancel the other. Now I want to talk about the women you will never know. Caroline Ingalls had tens of thousands of counterparts. Women who made the same journey, signed on to the same promises, wore the same work-worn daily clothes, while something fine sat in a trunk, and accumulated the weight of all the life they hadn't lived. Women who kept chickens and made cheese and washed laundry and mended the same garments until mending was no longer possible, and then cut the garments up and used the pieces for something else. Because nothing could be wasted, nothing could be lost, because there was never quite enough. These women left almost nothing, not because they were unremarkable, not because their inner lives were thin or their thoughts were simple or they didn't feel, with full ferocious intensity, every loss and every joy and every morning that arrived, requiring them to produce something from nothing again. They left almost nothing, because the culture that surrounded them did not record them. The census counted them as wives, the land records named their husbands, the newspapers, when they mentioned women at all, mentioned them for births and deaths, and the occasional remarkable act of courage that could be narrated as heroism, without requiring any analysis of the conditions that made courage necessary. The archive of the American frontier is, overwhelmingly, the archive of men who failed and were forgiven for it. The women who managed those failures, who translated inadequate income into survival, who raised children on insufficient food and kept households running on insufficient everything, who did all of this without legal identity or political voice, or any mechanism for saying this is not enough and it is not fair. Those women are in the margins. They are in the footnotes. They are in the documents their husbands signed when they needed government relief. They are identified as wives and mothers, and occasionally as the reason a man decided to stay. They are not, mostly, in the record as people. Caroline Ingalls is one of the lucky ones, in a specific and painful sense. She is lucky because her daughter wrote books. She is lucky because those books sold 60 million copies. She is lucky because scholars eventually became interested in the gap between what those books said and what really happened, and that interest led them back to her. She is lucky because we are here, now, asking the question that her life deserved to have asked 100 years ago. Most of her counterparts did not get that luck. Most of them are simply gone, their labour unrecorded, their suffering uncatalogued, their one good dress or the equivalent, whatever precious preserved thing they carried across their own particular wilderness, unmentioned in any document that survived. We will not recover them. That is one of the true losses of history, not the famous figures who were misrepresented, but the anonymous ones who were simply not represented at all. The millions of women who constituted the actual backbone of American westward expansion, and who exist in the historical record only as dependent variables in their husbands' stories. Caroline at least has a story, even if it had to be excavated from underneath the one her daughter told. There are very few photographs of Caroline Ingalls. This is itself significant. Photographs were expensive, and the family's limited resources meant they sat for portraits rarely, but some survive. A handful. The most reproduced shows Caroline in De Smet, in middle age, looking at the camera. She looks directly at it. Not the sideways glance of a woman embarrassed to be recorded. Not the downward cast of someone who expects to be overlooked. She looks at the camera with an expression that is genuinely difficult to read composed. Certainly, but not blank. There is something in her face that resists the simple interpretations. She does not look broken. She does not look nobly cheerful in the way the little house books might lead you to expect. She looks like a woman who has seen a great deal, who has thought about what she has seen, and who has arrived at some private conclusion about it that she is under no obligation to share with you. She looks, frankly, like someone who knew that the story being told about her was not entirely accurate. Maybe that is retrospective projection. Maybe I am reading into a photographic image the knowledge I've gained from everything you've heard in the last 7 chapters. But I don't think so. I think that expression, that direct, contained, not quite readable steadiness, is itself historical evidence. It is the face of a woman who had been managing other people's needs for her entire adult life, and who had, somewhere inside the management, preserved a self that the management did not touch. The dress was in the paper. The self was in that face. Historians use a technical term for what happened to Caroline Ingalls: narrative violence. The phrase sounds clinical, but what it means is specific and concrete. It means that someone else told your story in a way that did you harm. Not physical harm, the harm of misrepresentation. The harm of being reduced to a function. The cooking, the composure, the faith, the endurance, without the interiority that made those functions meaningful. The harm of having your poverty aestheticized rather than analyzed, of having your survival celebrated in a way that made other people's survival seem like a personal failure, of having the one good dress described as charming when it was actually a wound. What Caroline deserved was not a monument. She would have found that absurd, probably. What she deserved was accuracy. What she deserved was for someone her daughter, ideally, because her daughter loved her and was extraordinarily gifted with language to write a sentence that said, "My mother owned one good dress for 42 years of marriage, because the life she lived with my father never generated enough money to buy another, and that is a fact about her life that matters more than whether she could make maple candy or set the table beautifully." She didn't get that sentence from Laura. She gets it now, from the scholars who spent decades in archives, following the paper trail of a family the myth kept insisting had no need for paper trails, from the annotators who placed Pioneer Girl and the published books side by side and let the silence between them speak, from the historians who counted the crop failures and the relief barrels and the net proceeds of a homestead sold for less than $440 and refused to call it anything other than what it was. And from us, from this conversation, from the decision to ask finally and properly, what was the dress? The dress was not a charming detail. It was not a symbol of pioneer simplicity. It was not evidence of the romantic self-sufficiency that a daughter and a granddaughter would spend the 1930s trying to prove was the defining truth of the American frontier experience. The dress was a 42-year fact. It was the material evidence of a structural failure, the failure of a federal land policy designed to benefit railroads and speculators while presenting itself as opportunity for the poor. It was the evidence of a legal system that erased the woman wearing it from the record of her own life. It was the evidence of a culture that asked women to maintain composure and called the maintenance of composure contentment. It was the only beautiful thing Caroline Ingalls owned in her adult life. And she kept it. Not in spite of everything, because of everything. Because when you are a person whose interiority has been rendered officially irrelevant by the law, by the culture, by the economics that leave you no margin for anything beyond the absolutely necessary, the act of keeping a beautiful thing is not nostalgia. It is resistance. It is the refusal to fully become what your circumstances are trying to make you. It is the insistence, quiet and private and practiced daily, in the act of not opening the trunk and not taking the dress out and not wearing it to a world that would not have understood what wearing it meant. It is the insistence that you are more than what has been done to you. Caroline Ingalls kept the dress for 64 years. The dress is gone now. The historians have checked. It is not in any museum. It is not in any collection. It was worn out, perhaps, or sold after her death, or buried with her in the De Smet Cemetery on the 20th of April 1904, where she lies beside the husband whose dreams she followed across a continent and whose failures she translated every day into something her children could survive. The dress is gone, but here is what I want to leave you with. The question this whole story has been asking is not really about a dress. It's about what happens when a woman's story gets told by someone else. What happens when the telling serves someone else's needs, a daughter's grief, a granddaughter's politics, a nation's desire for a comfortable myth about self-sufficiency? What gets left in and what gets left out? What the absence reveals about the values of the people doing the telling? And whether, 100 years later, we have the honesty to go back to the trunk and open it. You know this story. Not because you've read the Little House books, though many of you have, because you've lived some version of it. Not the frontier poverty, not the grasshopper plagues, not the midnight escape, but the experience of having someone describe your life and get it slightly, significantly wrong, of being called cheerful when you were exhausted, of being told you were strong when what you needed was someone to notice that the strength was costing you something, of having your one good dress, whatever yours looks like, whatever private preservation of self you carry through the ordinary erosions of a daily life described as charming rather than understood, as the declaration it actually is. Caroline Ingalls' dress is gone, but she kept it for 42 years. And keeping the daily, private, unwitnessed act of refusing to be entirely reduced is the thing that was always the story. Not Pa's fiddle, not the maple candy, not the blizzard survived or the crops planted or the homestead proved up. The dress is on paper. The woman who kept it. That's the American pioneer story.